the previous video showed what happens when the world price is above the domestic price. Well, now let's look at another example where the world price, is below the domestic price. So that means when the country engages in international trade or on these world markets, the price that they're selling steel is much higher than the price that it's being sold in the world. So here we're going to start with consumers. So a consumer can buy steel that says made in the USA or steel that says made in Canada. To buy steel that's made in the USA, you have to pay this price here. Or you can buy the exact same steel at this price here. Well, a rational consumer would pay that lower price. And therefore, at that lower price, this becomes the quantity demanded. And so consumers aren't going to buy more for that steel. And so as a result, the amount of steel produced within the country is going to be much lower. And so this difference between quantity supply and quantity demand, this is what we call imports. Is the demand is higher than the supply, normally that would be a shortage. But here we can meet that shortage by just importing steel from another country. And so if this is the case, let's look to see what happens in this world market. Well, if we were to identify consumer surplus, so consumer surplus is the price, is the area above the price all the way to the demand curve. So this area right here, that's all consumer surplus. Now, if we were to identify producer surplus is the area below the price but above the supply curve. It's this little triangle here, that's producer surplus. And then if we were to identify the gains from trade, well, that's this area here. This is the part of the curve that would not have happened in a market, but now we do. So these are the gains from trade, which means that when the world price is below the domestic price, the country becomes a net importer. They import more than they would have otherwise. We also get consumer surplus will go up, producer surplus will go down, but in all, total surplus will go up even more, and we'll get gains from trade. So this is actually the type of market that the U.S. currently is in when it comes to steel. So if we look at the steel market, is current consumers of steel, so construction companies is one of the largest consumers of steel, can purchase steel made in the U.S. or steel made in Canada. The steel in Canada is much cheaper. Therefore, they prefer to buy it from Canada. And they do so, and therefore, based on a perfect competitive market or a closed market, this is how much steel would have been consumed beforehand. Instead, we see an increase in the amount of steel that's consumed at a lower price. But we also see this decrease in supply. And so what does this mean for domestic producers? This means domestic producers will decrease, or what we might call unemployment. Is they don't need to produce as much steel, and so therefore they hire less workers, they build fewer factories. And that's a big concern that the U.S. has, especially under the current administration, is that because U.S. consumers can buy steel at a lower price from Canada, then that disadvantages and harms domestic producers of steel. And is that argument correct? And the answer is yes, it is. As we showed, producer surplus goes down, right? We have this small little triangle here that it was much bigger. It was all the way out here, but now it's much less. But what they don't argue, and what you don't hear oftentimes, is that while yes, producers are worse off, consumers are more than better off than producers are worse off. In fact, consumers don't just capture all that was producer surplus, but they also get gains from trade. And so as politicians argue saying that trade is bad for the U.S., these trade deals, they're arguing for examples when the world price is below domestic price. And while it might be bad for producers, it is very good for consumers.